Hi, today we're discussing the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification version 1.0, which released on January 31st as scheduled by the Department of Defense. I'm Coby Pennington, Chief Compliance Officer with CastleLock. I'm joined today by James Hill, our Chief Technology Officer. Hello, James.
Good morning, Coby. How are you doing?
Doing well. So we had, as expected, as promised, the CMMC version 1.0 drop this Friday. Just a quick review over what the model is, what it contains, how we got here. The purpose of the CMMC was to provide a security framework for basically safeguarding the Department of Defense's intellectual property. CUI, which includes various different types of data, but really it's to address certain deficiencies in the supply chain. Enforce foundational level of security for all the different participants. So it's something that has been addressed in the past with a couple of different methods. We had the FAR 52 clause, we had the DFARS 252, 204, 7012. James, why do we need another method for handling cybersecurity within the supply chain?
Well, Coby, I think DoD realized that their current approach to supply chain risk management just probably isn't working. And I know those are strong words, but no one likes to be told that, you know, their self-attestation is wrong, or that they've accepted an appropriate amount of risk on behalf of the government. I mean, these standards were really put in place to protect DoD intellectual property, which they're calling CUI, or you might also hear it referred to as CUI. But I always refer to it as CUI. It feels a little more relevant. Ultimately, this is intellectual property, and just like you would in your organizations, if you're going to be sharing really sensitive information with companies outside of your organization, you probably do that. Well, you want to do that in a secure fashion, and you want to make sure there's some pretty good guardrails in place. And that's all this does.
Sure, absolutely. And like you said, they've done some different analysis against the supply chain. They have seen that, cybersecurity is a big deal. Adversaries are increasingly attacking systems. Data is being lost, and the level of controls around a lot of systems were not sufficient. And so it has a big impact on the supply chain. It has a big impact on the economy as well. So the CMMC addresses that by making it a contractual obligation. Now, there were some contractual obligations previously, but now there's a certification element to it. So to be able to be awarded a contract once the CMMC is in place for a particular RFP, then having that certification is an absolute requirement. But there may be some advantages to having the CMMC as well, and we'll talk a little bit about the schedule for the rollout here later in the presentation. But it's going to be a hard requirement. Like you mentioned, James, that means that the self-attestation is going to go away in favor of having an actual third-party assessment and certification process.
Yeah, and this has been a long time coming. I mean, if you look at the roadmap, you see kind of where they started out early on. There were 15 things that if you were going to be doing defense contracting, you needed to adhere to, right? And then they changed that, and in 2015 they submitted the 7012 clause, or they updated it to introduce 800-171, which was actually still in draft at the time when they introduced that. So there was still a lot of questions around there. NIST produced the 800-171A audit guide. And now here we are again. Okay, here's what we want you to do to protect our data. Here's how we want you to score yourself in a test when you protect our data. And now finally, for some of our suppliers, that's not good enough. We actually want you to get an accreditation from a third party. And this accreditation actually applies to all DoD agencies that you might want to bid on.
Right. And that's exactly right. And it's also builds on the work that's been done. So those earlier clauses, the 15 requirements, which ended up being like 17 within the NIST 800-171, a subset of that, 800-171, which was part of the DFARS 7012 clause, very much still in play within the CMMC. So those existing efforts are still very valid, but add some additional teeth really through the certification process is the big change. And that everyone will have to be some level of CMMC certified within the industrial base and chain.
That's pretty.
Thanks.
Is that your backyard view right there?
That would be lovely.
CMMC level 6 in effect.
So here we have the CMMC model, and as far as how it's broken down, and so there are 17 different domains, which are what we would have been if we were familiar. If you're familiar with NIST 800-171, these were basically the control families. Plus, there's an additional 3 around assets, recovery of systems, and situational awareness. And those different domains break down into capabilities, which is basically things that we need to achieve within each domain, following different practices and processes. And that's all determined by the level of CMMC that's going to be required for us.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about the families. I mean, if we look at 800-171 as we were self-attesting and using the 171A guide, there are definitely some critical things that were not touched, right? Supply chain management, asset management was a little bit hit and miss. Availability, situational awareness. These are some of the new families that we're seeing today, right? But they were left out of 171. And I think if you're coming from a non-federal cybersecurity background, you'll probably be a little bit more familiar with ISO 27001 standards. And I think what they've done here is try to pull from not just ISO 27000, but other compliance frameworks to really give you a well-rounded cybersecurity program that's continuously maturing, which is the goal for the CMMC model.
Absolutely. So yes, there are additional control frameworks that were considered in the CMMC, and also some of it was just based on threats. We know that a big threat now is ransomware, encrypting data or holding that data hostage, and recovery is a critical part of being able to recover from those attacks, but really just a critical piece of a healthy IT environment. I mean, the old saying is, you're only as good as your last backup. So it's good to see that's here. It's a very critical control for, the overall health of information systems. So the 5 levels that we've been talking about, we have those here. And really, I think we should probably focus in on level 1 and level 3. The reason for that is essentially everyone's going to have to be, at least level 1, even if they're not dealing with CUI. And then CUI protections really kick in at level 3. And most of the supply chain, most of the industrial base will be at somewhere in these levels. The more advanced levels for 4 and 5 are really for, suppliers or primes or that are dealing with very sensitive types of information and need to be able to protect that data at the appropriate level and be resilient to some pretty advanced threats. So
I really like, so I think this graphic is fantastic, by the way. I like how you've reflected the way that the different levels stack on one another. So if you're at level 3, you would have had all of the basic safeguarding of federal contract information requirements met. These are the original 15 that were in the 7012 clause back in the day. You will have done some level 2 items where you have some intermediate controls in place around protecting CUI, even though you will never see CUI at level 2. And then those things are the stair steps to get you to level 3 with a total of 130 controls. The original 800-171 was 110 controls. So we've got some additional items, but it's really not that big of a lift if you've already got the 110 in place.
yeah, you'll see quite a bit of overlap with some of the existing controls, but just makes it a little bit more explicit on and puts a little more emphasis on some of the things that they want to stress to hit that good level of security. And you'll notice a very big jump between level 1 and level 2. And really the purpose of level 2 is to give you a landing spot. If your organization is, trying to get caught up to the level 3, or, you don't quite make it, you have something that you can demonstrate that shows that your effort and that you're tracking towards that level 3.
And the key element of level 2, level 3, right? Level 2 is going to have what the federal contracting and the DCMA refer to as a plan of action and milestones, or a POAM, right? And that level 2 POAM is really what's going to record your steps to get to 3, right? So you got close, and a case for this would be, hey, I have a very mature organization. We're already ISO 27001. And so we come in and we do our evaluation, and the scope is the same information systems that maybe the CUI would be present on. Now, you don't have any controls in place to manage CUI. You don't have some FIPS validated algorithms that are in place. There's some housekeeping you may have to do. Well, you would come in and most likely certify at level 2 out of the gate. Whereas you could have your level 2 certification and then a plan for level 3.
Yeah, so very good points. And I think that leads us into a discussion a little bit on our observations from the final release versus some of the things that we were hearing leading up to this. We did an earlier webinar where we talked through, we're basically reading some of the tea leaves, anticipating where this thing was going. Those anticipations were based on what we were hearing. So a little bit of change in some regards, like the framework overall, I think stayed pretty close to where it was. There's a couple changes there, but one of the big observations was that the schedule is less aggressive for the overall CMMC rollout, and we'll talk specifically about that going forward. But there's definitely some emphasis to make sure that the timing's appropriate to give suppliers an opportunity to get things in place before this would have an impact on them. The last thing that they want to do is to orphan important suppliers from the supply chain when they're so critical to the overall function, delivery, and operations of defense.
Yeah, I think if I remember properly, there's a target of 1,500 suppliers for 2020 for this program. That's just what they have targeted, and of course they want to move out in an achievable way. So if I'm not one of that 1,500, Kobe, like what are my obligations here?
Well, there's a little bit of uncertainty there, but we can look to a couple of things to help answer that. One is that we would anticipate that some of the primes and larger suppliers are going to have a little bit more aggressive timeline because they definitely don't want to miss out on opportunities. So we know that this year, from an RFP, RFI perspective, there's two different sets that are basically going to drive that forward. So some dates that are notable is there's what is going to be a Pathfinders program, which is basically test and provide feedback on implementation of these controls. We have the accrediting body, which is going to start the certification process for those third-party assessors so that they can start certifying organizations. There's different training going to be available for levels, 1 through 5 on the schedule that you can see there, basically kicking off in July. And then that's, like you said, about 1,500 contractors that will start to show up in. But we also know that there are, for certain contracts that they are concerned with. At the same time, you got the DMCA, or the DCMA, sorry, the Contract Management Agency, part of Defense, that has certain things that they're looking for around the protection of CUI. And those are based on the DFARS 7012 and NIST 800-171 currently. But we also heard that there's going to be some changes to DFARS, maybe this spring or summer. That was hinted at the release.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up, and we're looking into the individual CMMC levels. This is a little bit tighter look at the stair step that we had, and from our perspective, our opinion, what are different policies or what are capabilities. These are quick hit things that we think organizations would want to have in place to achieve this particular level of certification.
Right. Exactly. So at a level 1, it is, from a documentation perspective, it's considered kind of ad hoc. But some basic policy would be helpful here. It may not be part of the actual audit, but it will help make sure that the practices are in place from an auditable standpoint. And at this level, you would expect this to be basic hygiene, which is exactly what this level is called. And it's essentially, firewall your systems, protect your systems from external and, attackers, know what devices you have, know who your users are, and make sure that, you keep your systems up to date. Level 2, you have everything that you had from level 1. And then you start to introduce a little more advanced things. And like you mentioned earlier, there are some controls here that are based around the protection of CUI. Because again, this is that step to level 3 that we've been discussing. I think the big one here is that you really have to start, doing backups, testing those backups, making sure that those backups are protected, and then multi-factor authentication, which is, an easier step probably than ever to implement in environments today, and really add some strong protection around the authentication process.
So the other thing I want to bring up is, we spend a lot of time focusing on the 7012 clause and like what's in there from a control perspective, right? If we're looking at possibly how these things will change, and the 800.171 gets flipped to CMMC level X, 1 or 3, or whatever the requirement is that for 7012, we don't want to ignore all of the incident reporting requirements that are in that 7012 clause as well. And this is where we start to see those come to fruition. So have that incident response policy, make sure you're tracking incidents, and then you'll see things about change management procedures if you don't have those things. So this is really, like what Coby said, this is really establishing that formalization around tribal knowledge on and making employees accountable for changes to the information system, and tracking these attackers as they hit your system.
Absolutely. So this is a significant step, which ultimately takes us to level 3, which is where most organizations are going to land if they have CUI protections. So if you're receiving flow downs that include the DFARS 7012 clause, if your contracts, you're receiving data that's marked for CUI or CTI or export control, one of the categories there, then likely if you're trying to anticipate where you need to land, this is most likely that level. So everything in the previous levels, some additional documentation, basically need to have documentation and resources for an information security program. DNS protection is a big part of this. I think that's a very good control from a filtering perspective, can really give some benefit to the organization from a protection perspective, and also continuously monitoring this, so making sure that these controls stay up and healthy.
So Coby, I think we've got some questions here. Did you want to take some questions, or you want to go over our next steps?
Yeah, definitely. Let's take some questions real quick, just cover some of the next steps on what we should be doing. Like we said, review your contracts, look to see where you have gaps. The CMMC is available. You can get that directly from the Department of Defense. So there's no question on what's necessary for the controls, what they are. They have a lot of guidance around those. Address those deficiencies, and build up a list of gaps like you mentioned earlier, and then when ready, schedule an audit. Not going to be able to schedule an audit for a while. They're still training the third-party assessment organizations, so you have a little bit of time, but definitely something that you want to be moving forward on. Be prepared. Yes, so let's get to those questions. All right. So one of the questions is, will agencies and primes push down the same level to the entire chain? And I think Katie Arrington addressed that during the kickoff, which said that the answer is no. Basically, the data classification, or the data that's being flowed down, will determine the level. So if CUI is the primary driver there, so if there's no CUI, no, you're not going to have to be at the same level of the primes, or maybe the higher tiers in the organization. So it really depends on how that data flows down. another question. Why pay attention to this now? The deadline is 2025 and the model is likely to change over time.
Well, okay. So the deadline is not 2025. I think that, I mean, if you want to get ahead of the requirements that could be coming to you in 2021, you should probably be taking a look at your contracts that you have now, understanding which of those have CUI and which don't. And if you're an organization that's not going to have CUI, you want to make sure that you're meeting those minimum requirements, which, like I stated before, have been in the DFARS clause since what I would consider, at least 10 years ago, right? Around those CMMC level 1. So they took the basic safeguarding of information, and you're required to have those 17 controls in place today, right? And those things will become CMMC level 1. So if you don't have those in place today, time to do a sanity check and go solve that problem. We can definitely help you out here at CastleLock with that. So reach out. And then if you're anticipating that you're going to be engaging with the Department of Defense and they will be sharing with you not classified information, but controlled unclassified information, ITAR restricted information, covered defense information like drawings and these types of things, data. If you're dealing with any organizations that provide personally identifiable information, any agencies that are providing this for you, then you were going to want to be at that CMMC level 3, which is the current 800-171 plus 20 new things to do.
Okay. And I think we probably have time for one more, which is what will happen to the current DFARS clauses. So currently, the existing DFARS clauses are still in effect. And so if we still have if your organization still has work to do there, that work is still very valuable. You should look at the CMMC level that you anticipate, which will depend on, your requirements around CUI, to look to those additional practices that are implemented to see where you're at. One of the ways to do that is to have a gap assessment. If you need help from a third party, that's something that CastleLock has a lot of experience with under the current DFARS and NIST 800-171. We're gaining familiarity with CMMC and working with customers on that today. But also there's going to be some changes to the DFARS clauses this spring and summer potentially, at least based on what we heard on Friday last week. So right now, anticipate just to keep moving forward with that effort, but definitely incorporate what you're seeing in the CMMC. James, any final thoughts?
No, appreciate the invite to the CMMC webinar. I hope my insights were as insightful as your insights. See, I bet you can't use insight 3 times in a sentence. But no, really do appreciate it.
Well, thanks, James. Very much appreciate it. Thanks all. Thanks everyone for their questions and participation. Goodbye.